Did you know that Italian prisoners of war who arrived in America in 1943 spent their first weeks writing letters home mocking their captors? They described Americans as uncultured barbarians obsessed with money, lacking any sense of history or tradition, living in a soulless industrial wasteland. "They have no art, no music, no cuisine," wrote Corporal Marco Salvatore from a POW camp in Texas. "They worship only the dollar. I pity them, their empty existence." 2 years later, when the war ended and repatriation began, over 30,000 Italian POWs formally requested permission to stay in America permanently. Marco Salvatore was one of them. He'd marry a girl from Fort Worth, open a restaurant, raise 4 children, and never return to Italy except for brief visits. This is the story of how Italian soldiers went from mocking America as culturally bankrupt to fighting to remain there, and how 2 years of captivity in Kansas or Texas or Oklahoma changed their entire understanding of what made life worth living. The story begins in the summer of 1943, when the first large groups of Italian POWs arrived at camps across the American heartland following Italy's defeats in North Africa and Sicily. These weren't just soldiers. They were sons of one of the world's oldest civilizations, men raised on Roman history, Renaissance art, and Mediterranean culture. They came from a nation that had given the world Michelangelo, Dante, and Da Vinci. They viewed themselves as inheritors of cultural sophistication that Americans, with their mere 160 years of history, couldn't possibly match. Lieutenant Antonio Rossini, captured in Tunisia, stepped off a train in Kansas in August 1943 with profound disdain for everything he saw. The landscape was flat and empty. No ancient ruins, no cathedrals, no history embedded in the soil. The towns were young, barely 50 or 60 years old, built of wood and brick rather than stone that had stood for centuries. The people seemed to him loud, unsophisticated, concerned only with practical matters of business and production. "This is not a civilization," Antonio wrote in his journal. "This is a factory masquerading as a country. They have no concept of beauty, of tradition, of living well. They exist only to produce, to consume, to accumulate wealth. I am imprisoned in a cultural desert." His fellow prisoners shared this contempt. They'd been taught that Italian civilization represented the pinnacle of human cultural achievement. Ancient Rome had ruled the known world, the Renaissance had enlightened Europe, Italian opera, Italian art, Italian architecture. These were the standards against which all culture was measured. What did America have? Mass production, assembly lines, Hollywood movies and jazz music, entertainment for the masses, not art for the ages. The Italian POWs were housed at camps like Fort Lawton in Washington, Camp Weingarten in Missouri, and Camp Hearn in Texas. The camps themselves reinforced their prejudices. Everything was new, utilitarian, functional, but lacking any aesthetic consideration. Barracks were simple wooden structures built for efficiency rather than beauty. The food was abundant but unsophisticated. The guards were friendly but seemed to lack any sense of cultural refinement. Private Giuseppe Marino, a Venetian glassmaker before the war, looked at the American mass-produced goods in the camp store with visible disgust. "Look at these glasses," he told his bunkmate, holding up a simple manufactured tumbler. "Identical, machine-made, no craftsmanship. In Murano we would make each glass by hand, each one unique, each one art. Americans make 1,000 identical glasses and think this is progress. They confuse quantity with quality." The Italian prisoners spent their first months reinforcing each other's cultural superiority. They formed opera clubs, sang Verdi and Puccini in the evenings, organized art classes where they sketched and painted. They cooked Italian meals whenever they could obtain ingredients, turning up their noses at American food. They maintained their identity as representatives of high culture imprisoned among Philistines. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, their understanding began to shift. The catalyst wasn't American culture trying to impress them. It was Americans not caring whether they were impressed. Antonio was assigned to a work detail on a farm owned by a man named John Thompson, about 30 miles from the camp. Thompson was a third-generation Kansas farmer, mid-50s, friendly but direct. He treated Antonio and the other Italian POWs working his farm as employees rather than prisoners, paid them the wages required by the Geneva Convention, fed them lunch alongside his own workers, and engaged them in conversation during breaks. Thompson's farm was 800 acres of wheat and corn, worked by machinery Antonio had never imagined. A single combine harvester could cut and thresh more wheat in an hour than a dozen Italian farmers could harvest in a day with hand tools. Thompson owned 2 tractors, 3 trucks, and equipment that represented more mechanization than Antonio's entire village in Tuscany possessed. "How much land do you farm?" Thompson asked Antonio during lunch one day, genuinely curious about Italian agriculture. "My family has 8 hectares, Antonio replied, doing the conversion in his head. "About 20 acres. We grow olives, grapes, some vegetables. It has been in our family for 11 generations. Thompson nodded appreciatively. 11 generations, that's something. My grandfather homesteaded this land in 1870. We're just 3 generations in, but we've built it up pretty well. That combine harvester over there? Paid for it with last year's wheat crop. It'll pay for itself in 2 more seasons." Antonio wanted to feel superior. His family's land had history, tradition, centuries of cultivation. Thompson's land was barely 75 years old. But he couldn't escape the mathematics. Thompson's 3-generation farm produced more food than Antonio's 11-generation farm could even conceptualize. One man with machines generated more productivity than an entire village of traditional farmers. "In Italy," Antonio said, trying to maintain cultural superiority, "we value tradition, quality, the art of cultivation. We don't just produce, we create. Each bottle of wine from our region is crafted with centuries of knowledge." "I'm sure it's excellent wine," Thompson said without any condescension. "I've never had Italian wine, too expensive for folks like me, but I bet it's good. Thing is, my farm feeds about 500 families. I produce enough wheat for thousands of loaves of bread. That's my craft. Feeding people efficiently, different from winemaking but valuable in its own way." The conversation stuck with Antonio. He'd dismissed American culture as valueless because it lacked history and tradition. But maybe value could be measured differently. Maybe feeding 500 families was its own kind of art, even if it didn't involve centuries-old traditions. Giuseppe had a similar revelation at the camp library. He'd expected to find no culture in American books, just practical manuals and commercial advertisements. Instead, he found thousands of volumes. American literature like Hemingway and Steinbeck, European classics in translation, technical books, art books, history books. The library was better stocked than most Italian town libraries he'd seen. More surprising was who used the library. American soldiers, common enlisted men, not officers or educated elites, checked out books regularly. Giuseppe watched a young guard, maybe 20 years old, check out a book on European history. Another guard was reading Moby Dick. These weren't educated aristocrats. They were farm boys and factory workers. Yet they read, learned, educated themselves because education was freely available. In Italy, Giuseppe told Antonio, education is for the privileged. The wealthy send their sons to university. The poor learn trades. But here, even common soldiers read serious books. The camp commander told me that most American children attend school until age 18. 18! In our village, children leave school at 12 to work. These Americans, they make education available to everyone, not just elites. The revelation was uncomfortable. Italian culture prided itself on sophistication, but that sophistication was concentrated among the educated classes. The average Italian had limited access to culture, education, or advancement. America seemed to democratize these things, making them available to common people rather than reserving them for elites. The Italian prisoners began noticing other uncomfortable truths. American workers, the guards, the farmers they worked with, the townspeople they encountered, lived better than most Italians. Not just better fed, which they had already noticed, but better housed, better educated, with more opportunities for advancement. Private Luigi Romano worked in a garment factory in New Jersey as part of a labor program. He watched American women, working-class women, not aristocrats, operating sewing machines, earning wages, having bank accounts, owning cars. In Italy, his mother had worked as a seamstress her entire life and owned nothing, dependent on his father's income. These American women had independence, financial autonomy, choices about their lives. The women here, Luigi wrote to Antonio, they speak their minds, they make decisions, they work alongside men and get paid wages. In our villages, women's lives are determined by their fathers, then their husbands. They have no independence. I thought this was natural, the proper order. But seeing American women, they seem no less feminine, no less family-oriented, yet they have freedom our women never know. Is our way traditional, Or is it just backward? The question applied to more than just women's roles. The Italian POWs were confronting the possibility that many traditions they'd valued weren't superior culture. They were just old limitations they'd learned to romanticize. The breakthrough for many Italian prisoners came during Christmas 1944. American communities across the country organized Christmas celebrations for the POWs, inviting them into American homes, sharing holiday meals, treating them not as enemies but as guests. Antonio was invited to the Thompson family's Christmas dinner. He arrived expecting an awkward, uncomfortable evening, trying to be polite to culturally unsophisticated hosts while missing home. What he found was a revelation. The Thompson home was modest but comfortable. The family, John, his wife Mary, their 3 adult children with spouses and children, welcomed Antonio warmly. They'd set an extra place at their table, treated him like family rather than a prisoner. The meal was American style. Roast turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce. Not sophisticated by Italian standards, but abundant, well-prepared, and served with genuine hospitality. After dinner, the family sang Christmas carols. Mary played piano, not expertly but competently with obvious pleasure. The children had learned instruments in school, violin, trumpet, clarinet, and played together. It wasn't a professional performance, but it was music, real music, enjoyed by a farm family in the middle of Kansas. Later, as Antonio helped wash dishes, Mary mentioned that her daughter had attended State University, studying to become a teacher. Her son had served in the army, come home, and started his own farm with a loan from a government program for veterans. Her youngest son was still in high school, planning to study engineering. In Italy, Antonio said carefully that these opportunities, university, business loans, professional careers, these are for wealthy families, educated families. Common people do not expect such things. Mary looked at him with surprise. But how do common people improve their situations? How do their children have better lives than they did? They don't, usually. A farmer's son becomes a farmer. A craftsman's son learns his father's craft. This is tradition, how society maintains order. That sounds like you're trapped by birth, Mary said, not unkindly. In America, we believe anyone can improve their situation if they work hard. My father was a poor immigrant from Ireland. He worked as a labourer, saved money, bought a small farm. My husband's family were homesteaders with nothing. They built this farm from empty prairie. Our children go further than we did. That's the American promise. Each generation has the opportunity to do better. Antonio went back to camp that night thinking about what he'd seen. The Thompson family wasn't sophisticated by Italian standards. They didn't quote Dante or discuss Renaissance art, but they had something his own family in Italy lacked. Opportunity, social mobility, the realistic hope that their children's lives would be better than their own. In Italy, Antonio's family had owned the same land for 11 generations. That sounded prestigious. But it also meant 11 generations had lived essentially the same way, with the same limitations, the same class position, the same expectations. The Thompsons had 3 generations of steady improvement, each generation achieving more than the last, which was actually better. By early 1945, as the war in Europe wound down, the Italian POWs had formed a more nuanced view of America. It wasn't culturally bankrupt, it was culturally different. It valued different things: practical innovation over tradition, social mobility over class stability, opportunity over hereditary position. Giuseppe, the Venetian glassmaker, had been learning about American manufacturing. He visited a glass factory in West Virginia and was astounded by the scale. "We make glass more beautifully in Murano," he wrote. "Each piece is art, but this factory produces more glass in one day than all of Murano produces in a month. They make eyeglasses, window panes, bottles, functional glass that millions of people can afford. Our glass is for wealthy collectors. Their glass is for everyone. Is that not also valuable?" As repatriation approached, Italian POWs faced a choice: return to Italy or attempt to remain in America. Italy was home, was family, was culture and tradition. But Italy was also devastated by war, economically destroyed, politically chaotic. The future was uncertain at best. America was foreign, different, lacking in history and tradition. But America was also peaceful, prosperous, full of opportunity. The question was, what mattered more, cultural tradition or practical opportunity? Antonio wrestled with this decision for months. He'd maintained correspondence with the Thompson family. John Thompson had offered him a job, real employment, not POW labour, working on the farm if he could obtain permission to stay. It was a genuine opportunity, something he'd never have in Italy where land was scarce and opportunities limited. "I am betraying my heritage," Antonio wrote in his journal. "My ancestors would be ashamed that I consider abandoning Italy for this young, uncultured nation. But my ancestors also never had the opportunities I see here. They were bound to their land, their class, their limited horizons. Is it betrayal to want more? Or is it foolish to refuse opportunity because of pride?" In the end, over 30,000 Italian POWs requested permission to remain in the United States. Many more would have stayed if immigration laws had permitted. These weren't men without options. They were soldiers who had been offered repatriation, offered return to their families and homeland. They actively chose to stay in the country they'd initially mocked. Antonio was among them. He filed paperwork requesting to remain in America as an immigrant. He worked Thompson's farm while his application processed, learning American farming methods, improving his English, adapting to American culture. In 1947, his request was approved. He became a legal resident of the United States. He wrote to his family in Italy explaining his decision. "I am not abandoning our culture or heritage. I am choosing opportunity over limitation. In Italy, I would inherit father's land, farm it as 11 generations have farmed it, and pass it to my sons to farm the same way. Here, I can build something new. I can improve each year. My future children will have opportunities I never dreamed of. This is not betrayal. This is hope." His family didn't understand initially. They saw it as rejection of everything Italian, embrace of American cultural imperialism. But as years passed and Antonio's letters continued, describing his life, his success, his growing family, they began to see his choice differently. Giuseppe also stayed. He found work in a glass factory in West Virginia, married an Italian-American woman whose family had immigrated before the war, and started his own small glass business. He combined Venetian technique with American manufacturing principles, handcrafted pieces made more efficiently, priced for middle-class buyers rather than only elites. "I am not abandoning craftsmanship," he explained to critics in letters home. "I am democratizing it. In Venice, our beautiful glass was for aristocrats. Here, I make beautiful glass that school teachers and shopkeepers can afford. That is not degradation of craft. That is expansion of opportunity." Luigi, who'd worked in the garment factory, stayed and eventually opened a tailoring shop in Brooklyn. He employed both Italian traditional tailoring techniques and American efficiency. His shop became successful not by competing with mass production, but by offering quality craftsmanship at reasonable prices. Not all Italian POWs stayed. Most returned to Italy, to family and familiar culture. But those who stayed became ambassadors of a new understanding, that different cultures valued different things, and American values weren't inferior, just different. The Italian POWs who stayed formed communities across America. They brought Italian cuisine to small American towns, opened restaurants that introduced Americans to regional Italian cooking. They brought craftsmanship traditions, woodworking, stonework, metalwork, and trained American apprentices. They maintained Italian cultural traditions while embracing American opportunity. Antonio married Mary Thompson's niece, a Kansas girl named Sarah, in 1948. They had 4 children. He continued farming, eventually buying his own land adjacent to the Thompson farm. He taught his children Italian, told them stories of their Italian heritage, but raised them as Americans with opportunities he'd never had. In 1965, 20 years after the war ended, Antonio made his first return visit to Italy. His village had changed little. The same families farmed the same land in the same ways. His brother had inherited their father's land and farmed it traditionally, as 11, now 12 generations had done. His brother showed him the family land with pride. "This is heritage," he said. "This is continuity. Your children in America, they have no roots, no history. They don't even speak proper Italian." "No," Antonio agreed. "They speak English primarily, Italian secondarily. They don't farm this land our ancestors farmed. They won't inherit ancient traditions." He paused. "But my eldest son is studying engineering at university. My daughter wants to become a doctor. My younger sons will choose their own paths, not have paths chosen for them by birth. They have opportunities I never dreamed of." His brother was silent for a moment. "You don't miss this? The history, the tradition, the culture?" "I miss it," Antonio admitted. "But I don't regret leaving. Culture is valuable, but opportunity is valuable too. In Italy, I was trapped by tradition. A beautiful trap, but still a trap. In America, I am free to build something new. My children are free to become anything they're capable of becoming. That freedom is its own kind of culture, its own kind of tradition." The conversation reflected the broader realization among Italian POWs who'd stayed. They hadn't abandoned Italian culture for American culture. They'd chosen opportunity over limitation, possibility over predetermined destiny. They'd accepted that young cultures could offer things old cultures couldn't, specifically freedom from the weight of tradition. In the decades after the war, the Italian Americans who'd been POWs became success stories. They opened businesses, raised families, contributed to American prosperity. They maintained Italian traditions, language, food, Catholic faith, while embracing American values of opportunity and social mobility. Their success sent a message back to Italy. Emigration wasn't cultural betrayal, it was rational choice. By the 1950s and 60s, millions of Italians immigrated to America, following paths blazed by former POWs who discovered that the country they'd mocked actually offered something precious, the chance to build a better life unburdened by rigid class structures and limited opportunities. In 1985, 40 years after the war, a reunion was held in Kansas for former Italian POWs and the families who'd hosted them. Antonio attended, now 70 years old, successful farmer and grandfather. He stood before a crowd of Americans and Italians and reflected on his journey. "When I arrived in 1943, he said, I mocked this country. I thought you had no culture, no tradition, no sophistication. I was wrong. You have culture, just different culture. You value opportunity over heredity, progress over tradition, individual achievement over family obligation. I thought these were weaknesses. I learned they were strengths." He paused, emotion thick in his voice. "I came as a prisoner of war. I stayed as an immigrant. I became an American citizen in 1952, but I never stopped being Italian. I just became Italian-American, carrying the best of both worlds. My children speak Italian and English. They know Renaissance art and American innovation. They honor tradition while building futures. That's synthesis. That is the gift America gave me. Not abandonment of culture, but freedom to build something new while honoring something old." The crowd applauded. The Thompson family, now including 3 generations since Antonio had known them, stood and embraced him. His own children and grandchildren watched with pride, and in that moment, the bridge between 2 cultures, 2 ways of seeing the world, felt complete. Did you know that descendants of Italian POWs who stayed in America now number in the hundreds of thousands? That many successful Italian-American businesses were founded by former POWs who saw opportunity in their captivity? That cities across the American heartland, in Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, have vibrant Italian-American communities founded by men who came as prisoners and stayed as immigrants? The Italian POWs who mocked America and then fought to stay learned the hardest lesson about culture. Tradition without opportunity is a museum, beautiful but dead. America wasn't sophisticated by European standards, but it offered something more valuable than sophistication. It offered possibility, the chance to build rather than inherit, the freedom to become rather than to simply be. They'd arrived as prisoners of a war they'd lost. They'd left as immigrants to a future they'd chosen. And in that choice, they proved that sometimes the deepest cultural wisdom isn't honoring the past, it's having the courage to build the future. Sometimes the greatest tradition is breaking with tradition to give your children chances you never had. And sometimes the country you mock becomes the country you love, not because it's perfect, but because it's possible. That possibility, that radical American idea that tomorrow could be better than today, that your children could achieve more than you did, that birth doesn't determine destiny, was the culture Antonio and thousands like him discovered in their captivity. It wasn't ancient or sophisticated or refined by centuries of tradition, but it was real, and it was powerful, and it was worth staying for.